Hello, everyone. Welcome back. We're going to jump right in and start our discussion off with K-pop. That's kind of our final destination for today, but I want to give you a preview of where we're headed and what kind of got us there in the first place. We're going to, in part two, also take a good chunk of time to talk about the Korean War and politics and how politics has impacted South Korea and North Korea, um, specifically with our focus being on music, of course. Let me pull up the lecture notes for today. Great. So we're going to deal mostly with this little bit right over here and then start moving ourselves up this direction and down this way. So K-pop is part of the 1990s Korean cultural wave known as Hallyu. And I think it's important to talk about that term specifically because it is a cultural wave that has changed over the course of time and has meant different things at different points in time. So I want to talk about the development of that word specifically in a video excerpt. But it happened during South Korea's very dramatic economic expansion and globalization. It went from being one of the poorest countries in the world to a major world player in manufacture, trade, and finance, and an expert wielder in soft power specifically. One of the big things that put South Korea on the map was the Olympic Games, a highly televised event that put Korea in the spotlight. But I want to talk about Hallyu first. And where that word originates and what it all entails. So let me pull up our first video excerpt for today.
Parasite.
Parasite made history at the 2020 Oscars, collecting the first Best Picture award for a non-English language film. That's even more impressive when you consider that South Korean cinema only began to garner major international attention in the late 90s. So what's the story behind the so-called Korean wave, also known as Hallyu, and where's the best place to start watching? After decades of military dictatorship, South Korea rapidly democratized between 1987 and 1997, culminating in the election of Liberal Prime Minister Kim Dae-jung. In the years that followed, the South Korean film industry blossomed as it began to access bigger funding and distribution opportunities, crucially developing without censorship. It's against this backdrop that a number of filmmakers who grew up during the military dictatorship, consuming American mainstream cinema as well as more artistic films by Korean directors, began to emerge as blockbuster auteurs. Bong Joon-ho, Park Chan-wook, Kim Ji-woon, and Lee Chang-dong have all made films that interpret specifically Korean themes and plots through the idiom of genre cinema, and each has achieved widespread critical and commercial success doing so. The obvious starting point for Hallyu is Shiri, a spy thriller which concerns North Korean sleeper agents working in South Korea. Far more interesting, however, is Park Chan-wook's joint security area. The film opens with a visually striking sequence portraying a mysterious death on the border between North and South Korea, before flashing back to several months prior to tell the story of a unique friendship formed between border guards on both sides. JSA differs from previous depictions of South Korea's fractured relationship with North Korea in several key aspects. Not only does the visual style consciously borrow from action and thriller cinema, the film's nuanced portrayal of North Korean soldiers was groundbreaking for its time. During the military dictatorship, draconian censorship laws encouraged filmmakers to portray North Koreans in an unambiguously negative, unsympathetic way. These one-dimensional portrayals removed the risk of being seen as sympathetic to communism, a punishable offence. With the liberalisation of South Korean politics came a new policy of cooperation toward the North, nicknamed the Sunshine Policy. Among the benefits of this was the ability to explore more carefully the lives of people in the North, even soldiers. As one of the first films to do this, JSA generated massive interest, and the film's success established Park as a director to watch. As the commercial film industry in South Korea expanded rapidly in the late 90s, the industry moved into other genres away from the established thriller and gangster movies. Horror made inroads with the popular Whispering Corridors series, and following in its footsteps with its prominent teenage female protagonist is Kim Ji-woon's A Tale of Two Sisters, released in 2003. The film follows Soo-mi as she arrives home from a mental institution and tries to protect her sister Soo-yeon from evil stepmother Yoon-ju. Director Kim takes this traditional Korean story as a loose starting point and filters it through the Gothic tradition, setting the action of women struggling with madness in an isolated, dark house and sprinkling in a few ghosts as well.
So, real quickly, just to make sure that no one's lost here, why talk about cinema? Well, cinema ends up being, or the moving image ends up being a huge component of K-pop. K-pop is not just a tradition or a genre rather of music. At this point, it has a decent history, which we can trace actually back to its beginnings to the late 80s. But in any case, it's a genre that is very tied to the visual medium. And one of the first unique expressions, one of the first unique expressions of this, this particular style is first seen in cinema. And that cinema is going to be very, is going to impact music in a very profound way, in as much as the moving image being very important to how music is disseminated. So to put it more succinctly, K-pop is a music video oriented medium above anything else. To give you an idea of what I'm talking about, let's just take a sampling of K-pop from its golden years, which we're currently living in. It saw its beginnings, like I said, in the 80s and late 80s and the 90s, and has had its heyday in the 2000s and since. In terms of cinema being a huge aspect of what's happening in a particular piece of music, music videos often have elaborate sets, elaborate costuming, elaborate choreography, color schemes, and oftentimes have entire preludes and postludes that are cinematic in quality. Let me pull up one example. So I hope that this remains intact in my video. This is Big Bang and it's called Fantastic Baby. Again, just want to give you an idea as to where we're headed and perhaps how Korean cinema of this Hallyu style ends up impacting our final format of how we like to disseminate K-pop, which is very visual and cinematic.
여기 붙어라 모두 모여라 We gon' party like 리리리라라라 맘을 열어라 머리를 비워라 불을 지펴라 리리리라라라 정답은 묻지 말고 그대로 받아들여 느낌대로 가 Alright 하늘을 마주하고 두 손을 다 위로 저 위로 날뛰고 싶어 Wow, fantastic baby Dance I wanna dance, 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 dance Fantastic baby Dance I wanna dance, 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 dance Wow, fantastic baby 이 난장판에 끝판왕 차례 땅을 흔들고 3분은 엄부충분한 breaks 분위기는 wire Catch me on fire 아냐 내가 누군지 네 심장 소리에 맞게 뛰기 시작해 막이 끝날 때까지 yeah. I can't baby don't stop this 오늘은 타락해 미쳐바라게 가는 거야.
All right, I wish we had time to watch all of it. Every single K-pop video that I watch, I'm just like, wow, all of the things going on. Like I said, K-pop is not just an auditory genre. It is a visual medium. It is a lifestyle. It is it's a hair choice. It's a lot. But we need a number of things to bridge the gap to get us here. So Korean cinema, which has since exploded, especially due to the big win of Parasite, has its roots in the 90s. As you could see and hear, there were a number of interesting restrictions imposed by the government that really altered cinema as being perhaps a true view of expression, especially initially. And for us to kind of understand why that is, why that happens, preceding the 90s, we need to go back in time to the 1950s again and talk about the Korean War. And the Korean War, here, let me pull up my lecture notes. Sorry. So the Korean War is, here we go, conflict that has a tremendous impact on both the United States and Korea and other regions as well. But Korean popular music really grew out of the conditions of occupation and war. Before we even get to the Korean War, Japanese had colonial rule over Korea from 1910 to 1945. And then after World War II, the occupation of Korea by the US, followed by the devastation of the Korean War, was really the rebuilding under a dictator, which was C.H. Park. And that tumultuous history, which happens, over the course of not all that much time, ends up really having an impact on the fabric of, culture in Korea. So let's talk about Japanese occupation first, before we get to the Korean War. Under Japanese occupation, Korea underwent a rapid expansion of urbanization, technology, industry, and commerce. As we've already made note of, the technologies of recording and broadcasting made a wide range of music available. So we have we owe a huge tip of the hat to technology. By the 1920s, due to technology, you could go to a location and encounter a number of different musical traditions. For example, you might hear at a cafe European art music. You might hear original Korean songs or Japanese melody or early imports of jazz. The first concert of actual popular music in Korea took place only in 1933. And by the time of the Japanese surrender in August of 1945, Korea was the second most industrialized nation in Asia after Japan itself. So huge changes that happen in half of a century. So the world wars, both of them, have profound impacts on history. Speaking specifically to World War II, which really does set the stage for the Korean War. Korea was divided into zones that were occupied by the Soviets in the north and the Americans in the south. And that is the starting of our division of both North and South Korea. So there was no agreement on unification, and as a result, two separate governments were established. South Korea was officially named the Republic of Korea, and North Korean forces invaded South Korea in 1950, which began the Korean War. The North drew support from China, and the South drew support from the US. It took 3 years of bloody fighting in which some 3 million Koreans, 1 million Chinese, and 54,000 Americans were killed. I want to, not just summarize the Korean War in a paragraph. I've got a video that goes into some of the more political aspects of what spurred that, that conflict, because it's truly going to set the stage for what happens with music. Again, our primary focus.
The Korean War, June 25, 1950 through July 27, 1953. At the end of World War II in 1945, Korea was freed from Japanese control. North Korea was occupied by the Soviets, while the South was occupied by American forces. By 1948, the country was divided in half at the 38th parallel, with the capitalist South ruled by Syngman Rhee and the communist North ruled by Kim Il-sung. The Soviet troops withdrew from Korea in 1948, and U.S. troops withdrew in 1949. However, North and South Korea, as enemies of one another, would not accept the border between them as permanent. The North Koreans attacked South Korea on June 25, 1950, advancing across the 38th parallel. Around 75,000 troops of the North Korean People's Army defeated the Republic of Korea's army with success, capturing the capital city of Seoul, then occupying the whole of South Korea except for Busan. This was a problem, as President Truman and the United States wanted to contain the spread of communism by preventing the domino effect. That is, if Korea fell, so would other countries to the ideology. South Korea appealed for support, and the United States pushed a resolution through the United Nations Security Council. The USSR did not use its veto power, as it was boycotting the council because the new communist China was not accepted. In China's seat was the pro-US Chinese nationalist government of Taiwan. An appeal was made by the Security Council for North Korea to withdraw its troops, but was ignored. As a result, approval was granted for a UN army made up of an international force of 16 nations to send help to South Korea, commanded by General Douglas MacArthur. The UN troops, composed mainly of Americans, landed in South Korea in early July, but were soon pushed back on the defense by the North Korean forces, forming a perimeter around Busan to defend the line until reinforcements arrived in August. Now that their position was strengthened, MacArthur went on the offensive. On September 15th, the U.S. Marines X-Corps launched an amphibious assault at Incheon. The North Korean troops were pushed back on the retreat over the 38th parallel, and soon Seoul was recaptured along with the whole of South Korea by the end of the month. Now, MacArthur was to go beyond the initial idea of containment. Truman, worried of a Chinese response, nevertheless approved, and UN troops moved into North Korea on October 7, 1950. On October 12th, they captured Pyongyang, the North Korean capital, and then the Yalu River, which was the border with communist China. China retaliated by helping the North Koreans, sending 250,000 Chinese troops. The UN troops, overwhelmed by this new force, were pushed out of North Korea with heavy losses. By January 1951, Chinese and North Korean troops had captured Seoul. General MacArthur wanted to use the atom bomb on China and was dismissed for insubordination by President Truman, who went back to a policy of containment. In June 1951, more UN troops were sent to Korea, eventually driving the North Korean army to the 38th parallel and stabilizing the front. Now, a stalemate set in. In July, peace talks began, but a compromise could not be found. Meanwhile, Fighting continued, and American pilots fought in the air against Soviet pilots using Chinese jet fighters and wearing Chinese uniforms. General Dwight D. Eisenhower took over as president in early 1953 and sought an end to the war. After 2 years of negotiation, an armistice was signed on July 27, 1953, at Panmunjom on the 38th parallel. A demilitarized zone was set up, which stands to this day. Subscribe and click the notification bell for more history videos.
Very good. So,
Thank you guys for all your support on the Simple History
Yes.
YouTube channel.
very good.
If you enjoy it, please consider
Sorry. So Korean War has some, again,
visiting our Patreon page. There,
profound impacts on what's to come with music. And effectively, of course, the division of North and South Korea exists still. And the K-pop is a commercial and musical export of South Korea very specifically. And we're going to draw our attention to what happens in South Korea post the Korean War. Let me pull my lecture notes back up. There we go. So post Korean War, South Korea underwent another revolution. And it was the end of Japanese musical dominance and the beginning to start to adopt some preferences for American music and American styled music. So with Korea's economy devastated by the war, the soldiers that were stationed over the mass majority of the US military bases were practically the only consumers of music at that time that were being recorded by Koreans. And they ultimately were catering to the American taste by imitating the then popular American style. In the late 1950s, venues for performances for USJIs probably exceeded the total export earnings of South Korea, which is very, very interesting. It really draws attention to who was paying for entertainment and how much money was going for entertainment at that time. So South Korea was under the dictatorship of Chung-hee Park, and that was from 1961 to 1979. And Park really spurred an economic growth plan that led to South Korea's modernization. The beginning of that era saw a growth of the recording industry, radio, TV, and broadcasting, and the creation of a national style of song called trot. And trot is a particular genre of music that speaks specifically to post-war experiences of common people in a very kind of sloppily sentimental, old-style fashion. It ended up being that Park really hated trot because of its Japanese influence. But rather than talk about trot in the abstract, I want to play us a sample of what trot sounds like. It might sound familiar to you. One thing that's particularly interesting, and we'll play a second video after this, is that trot is in vogue again. You know, history repeats itself, fashion seems to come in waves, and trot being on the out for a very long time is now back on the in. There are a number of sort of Korean versions of like You've Got Talent or America's Got Talent that are now geared specifically to trot. Mr. Trot specifically has caught fire and is incredibly popular right now. So I want to play an example of original trot, though.
서향서리며 대른가 숨만 늘고 수평 같은 내 신세가 혼자도 기막혀서 창문 열고 바라보니 하나름 젖어.
So trot, in this case, the language is going to be in Korean for the lyrics. And since its decline in popularity in favor of, more pop-oriented, we're going to talk about the Korean Madonna and the Korean Michael Jackson in our next part. But trot as a style has come back, and I want to play one other video that is directed towards trot and its move towards popularity today, and it covers a little bit of history of it as well.
Hey guys, this is Korean Onni. There are lots of auditions programs in Korea like Show Me the Money Hip Hop, Produce 101 K-pop, but the hottest audition program right now in Korea is TV Joseon's variety show Mr. Trot. Now, what is trot? Trot, pronounced as 트로트 in Korean, sometimes even called 뽕짝, which is an onomatopoeic term for trot due to its distinctive background rhythm that goes 뽕짝 뽕짝. Is an old-style music genre that was formulated in the early 1900s. The characteristic of trot is its repetitive, simple beat with less complicated melody that makes it easy for everyone to sing along. But yet being very emotional that pulls the heartstrings of listeners. Surprisingly, trot music didn't exactly originate in Korea, rather it was influenced by Japan during the colonial rule and from Europe and US. Though the historical origin of trot may have its foreign roots, there can be no question that Koreans made trot their own, and now it's considered one of the most Korean genres. And being Korean means that it contains the emotion of Han. Here are some representative songs. However, many trot singers were pushed out of business since many young and hip K-pop artists have become the norm and dominated the music industry since the 1990s. And it seemed like trot singers were left behind in the dust. However, trot has survived, and actually even more, it has thrived. Now these are some backgrounds of how trot survived in the midst of the popularity and the global expansion of K-pop. In the mid-2000s, trot came back to life, being called the new generation trot, and some popular songs are 어머나 from 장윤정, 어머나 and 사랑의 배터리 by 홍진영, 나를 사랑으로 채워줘요. 무조건 무조건이야 by 박상철. 당신을 향한 나의 사랑은 Idols began singing Trots. 대박이야 by Big Bang 대성.
여보 당신 애기 뭐라 불러드릴까 내 님은 지금 무얼 하고 있을까 밥 먹었다 잠은 잘 잤다 하루 왼종일 우리 공주님 생각뿐
록국어 by Super Junior T.
많다 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 많아 다 이쁜 이쁜 이쁜이다 여보게 저게 보여 여보 안경 안 보여
And now there's an addition program for Trot, which is a combination of the format popular to younger generation and the music genre that is popular to older generation. Miss Trot, Mr. Trot, 나는 트로트 가수다. Combination with dance and EDM also had a huge role in getting attention from the younger generation who likes to dance.
So I'm going to pause right here just for a second. We'll go back to the video. So one of the things that we've seen is that Trot has, always existed against the emergence and popularity of K-pop. Again, its decline in popularity was part in because of the dictator who, again, being in place until the late 70s, ends up having a huge impact on, the music that is consumed at that time. One thing that I kind of think is so interesting about Trot, even the 1960s example, is it sounds very much like a jazz ensemble, that there are particular things that sound like American imports, but the vocal inflection of the singing, the pitch bending, the lyrics, and the content are very much Korean. And one thing that we've seen even in the survey of her her examples, that as we've kind of pressed forward with time, we've seen some kind of crossover that's happening between Trot and K-pop. What we've probably noticed most is that we have high quality looking music videos that seem to have a complete and total design to them. Let's clue into the rest of this video snippet.
With EDM music, and the popular music is 김연자 Amor Fati. Well, it seems like this genre Trot just never refuses to die. Even this famous comedian Yoo Jae-seok turned into a new Trot singer with the nickname 유산슬. It seems like the heat of Trot also matches the neutral trend of the younger generation, since the younger generation like the freshness from the old things and they like to be different. I'm different. I'm different. I'm different. I listen to Trot.
항구의 남자는 할매키도 사랑한다네
90세에 저 세상에서 날 데리러 오거든 진또배기 때문에 못 간다고 전해라.
The music itself has an almost karaoke-like aspect to it. I mean that in a complimentary fashion. This idea that the music that accompanies it often has a synthesized quality to it. Not so much that it sounds like they are synthesizers, but that they are music that has been pre-recorded. We don't see any really elements of live instrumentalists for the most part with Trot. And it invites this audience, kind of this participation factor from everyone, which I think is quite charming. I want to wrap up our part two, just going back to lecture notes and framing what we're going to be talking about for part three. As I said, trot was popular certainly before K-pop emerged, and was in the background and brewing, taking a back seat while K-pop was in its heyday, and it kind of still continues to be, although as we've seen and heard, trot has made a comeback. There's a little bit of perhaps things to consider is that, like, music, specifically at the early part of Park's rule in the 60s, wasn't super widely disseminated. Most of Korea in the 60s was lacking energy and did not have access to popular American music, and or found American music fairly loud and alienating. In the 1970s, the average income of the Republic of Korea shot up by more than 100%. But as the Park regime became increasingly authoritative and repressive, American styles such as psychedelic rock and folk revival songs were banned due to concerns over morality and political content. So we have a big crescendo in government crackdown which happens from the 70s into the 80s. However, with this extraordinary and unprecedented rise in wealth in the Republic of Korea, the younger generation was able to become independent and create a market for popular music idioms of the West that had long been suppressed by the military government. So the new and most exciting medium of expression that came from the United States for the Korean youth was the music video. And that's where we're going to pick up our third section, talking about the 1980s and the sort of birth of K-pop with our Korean Madonna and our Korean Michael Jackson. So I will see you in part 3 shortly.